Welcome to Relationships 101. I'm Dr. Donna Tonry, and I'm the Director of the Counseling and Family Therapy Master's Program here at Salle. I'm very pleased to be with you today, and also pleased to have Dr. Michael Sood and Dr. Dina DiNardo joining me for a conversation about relationships. Both Dr. Sood and Dr. DiNardo are licensed marriage and family therapists and teach in our Marriage and Family Therapy Master's Program. Today, we will discuss issues of intimacy. Welcome, Mike and Dina. And to begin our discussion, I would like to kind of make a statement about the three of us and marriage and family therapy. And all three of us are trained as marriage and family therapists, which basically is we're trained in relationship issues. So we're, I guess I would say, experts in relationship issues when we work with clients. And I think that it's really important to emphasize that, because today we're going to be talking about intimacy, and in that conversation we'll be talking about couples. And one of the things that I believe that's so important when therapists are working with couples, that they have a training in relationships, a training in systems meaning a family system, a relationship system, and I think it makes all the difference when working with couples. So we'll be talking about some issues that can be challenging for therapists to work with today, and I thought it was important for our audience to know that training as marriage and family therapist is a crucial ingredient in the success of helping couples. Would you agree with that? Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, so Mike, I'd like to start with you, and talking about intimacy. To me, from my experience, it's not uncommon for couples to come in with intimacy issues. Mm-hmm. Can you think of anything in particular that seems to be a common factor when couples come in and they present that they state that they have issues with intimacy?
Yeah, I think that a lot of couples that come in are emotionally disconnected, which then can affect other parts of their relationship. But what we find is that I think a lot of couples that split up feel very unloved, like each partner, and feel very disconnected. Mm-hmm. And that's, what we know is if not the primary, one of the primary kind of reasons that people split up, that they report. Right. There's other things, violence, there's affairs, there's other things, but that's a huge one. Is that, people usually drift and wind up leading these kind of quote-unquote parallel lives, mm-hmm. and feel very disconnected from each other. And I think that the idea of intimacy for me is this kind of shared vulnerability. And so I think, so this is why I always say it's so difficult. I think working with couples is my favorite thing to do as an MFT, and I think it can be the most difficult work. Mm-hmm. It's not a secret that most couples don't last. Mm-hmm. It's very, very hard to do. Mm-hmm. And I think both have to be into it. Mm-hmm. So if they're going to be emotionally connected and have this shared vulnerability or intimacy, both have to be, one person isn't enough. Right. Which I think is part of what makes it so difficult, and very different than parent and child. Mm-hmm. A parent can hang in even when a child is, and the relationship can sustain. Right. Mm-hmm. Couples don't really work that way. Right. Mm-hmm. I remember asking one of my supervisors when I was training, what happens if one partner wants to be in and the other doesn't? And she said, the partner who doesn't wins. It takes two. Right. So I don't know if that answers your question.
And it makes sense, because one of the things I hear from couples is that each other's supposed to love each other unconditionally. And I think they sometimes confuse unconditional love as a parent with what it means to be a couple, because there are conditions. And they sometimes don't want to face the conditions because each one is responsible for those conditions.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree.
Mm-hmm. Dina, would you like to add to that?
Sure. Well, I'm glad that you pointed out how you're describing intimacy as a shared vulnerability.
It's not my definition, but it's stealing someone else's.
Sure, yeah. And one that you're using, but I think that's where it starts, is couples have very different ideas about what intimacy even means. And so we often find that we're starting with, what is intimacy to you? And then we share a little bit about what we think intimacy is. And I think defining it is an important way to start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think couples often think of it as only physical or sexual intimacy.
Yeah, agree.
Mm-hmm. And so expanding that idea, would be very helpful.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yes, I think it's quite common that when a therapist says to them something about intimacy, immediately they think sexual intimacy, and not recognizing that all other levels of intimacy are so important. And sometimes when there's that lack of intimacy, it shows up in the sexual relationship.
Absolutely.
And they think they just don't have intimacy because they're not having sex, when in reality they're not having sex because the intimacy in the other areas isn't being nurtured.
Yeah.
Or going back to what you were saying about the vulnerability. You know, it's interesting because I often say to couples, for me, when I'm helping a couple, the goal is, one of the goals, is to help them to create the safest place for each of them to go to in that relationship with each other. And that sometimes is foreign to couples. And I think we have this romantic view that, okay, we fell in love, now we're happy, it's happily ever after, and we don't really have to do anything about it because we were so happy when we fell in love, and that will last us till death. And when they find out it doesn't really work that way, and they need to put effort into it, they think it's supposed to be effortless.
Or the things that made them happy when they first fell in love are
Right.
not still the things that make them happy anymore.
Right.
And so because they've changed, sometimes they put the blame on the relationship. Something within the relationship isn't making me happy, versus looking inside and, well, what is going to make me happy isn't the same as it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 5 years ago even.
Yeah. Sometimes it's interesting because it's not uncommon for couples to come in and point the finger at the other person. But I actually find it more difficult when one of the persons is willing to take all the blame. It's like, okay, then you really are, now you're kind of stuck, because when this person actually thinks that they have to take all the blame, it really, I think they think they're helping the situation, when in reality I think it hurts the therapy, because it's very hard to go from that place to kind of look at one person and say, okay, you're in charge of all the intimacy and the other person doesn't have to do anything.
Sure.
Which then in a sense is the opposite of intimacy.
Right.
What are your thoughts about when that happens, someone coming in, taking all the blame?
I don't have that happen. I haven't had that happen a whole lot. It's more likely
I
that they
have
point
had it
fingers.
I have
guess,
that all the time. But
Yeah, I think that's most common. I guess when I have this experience, I mean, within a couple relationship or even other places, sometimes, I'm the worst, it's all my fault. I think that I have my own kind of concerns about that as well, as somebody asking to be taken care of, and it's not that bad, and so there's other concerns that I have about that kind of stance. But I often see someone that is not maybe not feeling like they can do a whole, like doesn't have a lot of hope that they are very important or effective in the relationship, which is kind of sad to me. Because if someone is making someone else that upset, then clearly they're important.
this is true.
Yeah, like in other words, this is a common reframe that we use, right? Well, if you make your partner that unhappy, like if they didn't care, they wouldn't be that upset.
That's right.
So like it's a nice way that we can, and hopefully that can help them feel a little more like they matter. But that concerns me, although I don't say it much.
Well, it's interesting because I've had situations with couples when one will say that they're so upset with the other because they're not coming through and they're not there for them and they're not spending time with them and they're not paying attention, and I think I just want to be out of this relationship. And I will go to exactly what you're saying. Well, if you're that upset that they're not paying attention to you, they're not coming through, they're not spending time with you, it doesn't actually sound like you want to be out of the relationship. You want more from the relationship and you're not getting it. And sometimes that is it's like an eye-opening experience for the person, because they're really thinking they want out, but everything they're complaining about is they want to be closer to this person. So I think sometimes people feel it, but they can't actually see the message that they're delivering.
And I think what also can be connected to that and really tarnish intimacy is wanting the partner to give them something, but they don't want to have to ask for it explicitly. They almost want their partner to mind read what's going on for them.
Right.
And when they're not able to do it, they fall short, and then that partner is not getting their needs met, is judging them. But really the courage that it takes to identify what do I need and then ask for it is something that I find that I'm often trying to help people do in a couple setting.
And maybe it ties back to that vulnerability again, when the person has to, or feels as though they have to ask for it. I think it puts them in a position of vulnerability, and
That's right.
really they don't want to be vulnerable. So if you just know what I need, then I don't have to go to that vulnerable place.
Or they've been vulnerable before and it hasn't gone well or wasn't received for whatever reason. And it could be the context, it could be the day, it could be what was going on. But we would have to explore that a little bit.
Right.
Was there ever a time that you asked for what you needed and you didn't get it?
Even if it wasn't a couple relationship.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
Right. And going back, Dina, to what you said about things may not be the way they were when they first met. And I think people forget that they're not the same as they were when they first met. They're evolving, and they're not, the same.
Yeah, that gets really tricky when we talk about that in class sometimes, where this idea that we want to accept, the person who we have and love them for who they are, but who they are changes and who we are changes. So that gets really complex.
Right. Right.
That we have to kind of keep accepting how ourselves and our partners change, and be open to that.
And really embrace it, because it's beautiful. You wouldn't want the person, especially if it's a young couple and they get together when they're, say, 25 and they marry. Well, you wouldn't want them to be the same at 45. That would be sad, that a 45-year-old would not have evolved into someone not necessarily different, but more of who they are. And
Sure.
I think when clients can see that it's a beautiful thing, it's wonderful that you've evolved into someone different.
And to me, this speaks to why being trained as an MFT, very specifically, is so important to doing couples work, because we're understanding about the types of relationships that they've witnessed, that they grew up with, that their parents had with one another. We don't learn about how to have a relationship in school, in elementary school or high school. We don't learn about how to build intimacy and how to grow with someone, or how to even grow as an individual.
Right.
So,
Right. I mean, it's certainly incredibly complex in all aspects of the couple relationship, the family of origin that they come from, the couple system that they created. And I think it is the MFT who is trained to deal with all of those systems at the same time and be attentive to all aspects of it while working with a couple. It's quite challenging. It's not such a easy feat.
Agreed.
Well, I think we have a lot to talk about, so when we come back, as you can see, there is much more to come about relationships and intimacy. We will take a short break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation.
My name is Blake. I received a heart transplant when I was 2 weeks old. I play defense for the Red Hot Tornadoes. Sometimes my heart starts pounding like faster and faster as I go. I know I have someone else's heart inside me. It makes me feel happy because someone was generous enough to give me a second chance to live.
This gift of life was made possible by an organ donor. Imagine what you could make possible. Sign up as an organ, eye, and tissue donor. Go to organdonor.gov.
Chris Domine is a husband, father, an athlete, even an Ironman. But 10 years ago, Chris's kidneys were failing.
The doctor said if you don't do dialysis, if you don't get a kidney transplant, you are going to die.
Then Chris received a second chance, made possible by an organ donor.
Your well-being changes from loss of hope to better times ahead.
Imagine what you could make possible. Learn more and sign up as an organ, eye, and tissue donor. Go to organdonor.gov.
It's the most natural thing for me to dance, but I was tripping and I was falling and didn't even know what multiple sclerosis was.
When I perform, I really love connecting with people. It's definitely cool to be able to give someone an experience through virtual reality.
Oh my God. I dream sometimes and I see that.
Welcome back to Relationships 101. I am your host, Dr. Donna Tonry, Director of LaSalle's Counseling and Family Therapy Master's Programs. Joining me to discuss healthy relationships and the issues of intimacy are Dr. Michael Sood and Dr. Dina DiNardo. Welcome back. I thought maybe it would be valuable for us to continue the conversation about sexual intimacy versus emotional intimacy, and the confusion I think that comes up for couples regarding the two. So maybe we should start a little bit with sexual intimacy and what you think clients, for the most part, come in thinking when they're talking about sexual intimacy.
So I don't know if you want to start. I'll start, I guess.
Okay.
And you just stop me. I think that I think a few things. I think first of all, our portrayals in the media of what sexual relationships are terrible. As a broad statement, that usually sexual activity is much clumsier. It's much broader than is portrayed. It often doesn't include same-gender couples or alternatives to like traditional male-female intercourse. So I think couples, unfortunately, often come with a very narrow view of sexual relationships, and like in movies and TV shows, usually it's like always like pleasurable for both people at this. It's just very unrealistic, at least in my experience. And so I think people have this very idealistic view that's portrayed of what like sexual activity is and what it should be. And so like, you know, all couples have bad sexual experiences. Like, you know, periodically.
Right.
That it's just that's what our research, even the couples that have the best sexual relationships have that.
That's right.
I think another thing is our research tells us that we don't tend to value sexual relationships or activity when it's good. Like, it's only a big deal when it's terrible. Right? So like when it's good, we're told that it doesn't contribute much positive to the relationship, but when it's bad, it's by far the biggest problem. So if we're only going to value it when we're not liking it, that's like a recipe for disaster. So I think there's many issues, and I also think how emotionally connected they are affects sexual relationships. So.
Right, so as you were talking about when it's bad, it really, you know,
it's a disaster.
It's magnified.
Yeah.
However, I think very often when it's bad, it's connected to so many other things that are happening in the relationship that the couple is either not aware of, or somewhat aware of and not attending to, or avoiding, or in denial about. There's something going on, and that tension comes into the sexual relationship, and then it gets attached to the sexual relationship, which in some ways can be safer.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it absolutely does. And it's also more tangible, like it's than like emotions, which are much more intangible.
Right. This happened. It's pretty concrete.
Yes.
I have just experienced this, and you were there.
Right.
So I have proof in a sense.
Exactly.
Whereas when you go back to something that either wasn't addressed, wasn't talked about, hurt feelings, something that maybe the person can't even define for themselves.
Sure.
So they don't even know exactly how to, you know, deliver a message. But it's easy to say when it comes up in sex.
Agreed.
A lot of blame, I think, can be put on that aspect of the relationship, and then the personal responsibility for the individuals gets a little lost, I think, in the translation. But I would agree with everything that you said, and drive often seems to be one of the biggest disconnects for couples. Someone has a high drive and someone has a low drive.
Right, right. And accepting that and coming to a place of compromise. It isn't that one has to meet exactly where the other is at, but maybe even defining what the needs are and then coming to a place that maybe is more soothing, in a sense, for each other, and not that you have to be one or the other. And that no one takes total charge of it, because oftentimes the person with the lower drive is kind of in the driver's seat, and that can be really difficult for the person that has the higher drive. And okay, so then it adds another component. I don't matter. Like what I need doesn't matter. And then that goes to a whole nother
and often if they're feeling that way in other aspects of the relationship, that I don't matter, I'm not important, it's another place where it comes from.
I tend to use it as or view it as a metaphor for what's happening in other aspects of the relationship, certainly.
Well, and I've in working with clients that have come in and named that they're there for sexual intimacy, that's the reason that they're coming in. But then as we begin to talk and I start uncovering other aspects and realizing, well, there's communication issues, there's understanding issues, there's not putting any energy into the relationship other than when they go to the bedroom, nothing in between. And when that begins to happen and they begin to pay attention, very often the sexual problems begin to melt away because it wasn't a sexual problem in the first place. It was intimacy at all the other levels.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So why do you think that it's so common for couples to not understand emotional intimacy in and of itself, not connected to sex?
It's just really, quite frankly, not discussed. I mean, we don't talk about emotional intimacy. Mike referenced the media. We're talking much more about sexuality and objectifying people. We don't have those conversations in everyday life. And I think some people, maybe, I don't know, I truly believe a lot of people don't know how to articulate their feelings. They don't even necessarily know what they're feeling oftentimes. And so the language isn't there, the recognition isn't there.
Absolutely.
And the vulnerability is, meaning in order to examine it, to figure it out, and then talk about it, is can be daunting.
Yeah, I mean, and being vulnerable and sharing is quite a risk, as we're saying. It could not go well, even in relationships that are really satisfying in a lot of ways. It doesn't always go well. So people take large risks, especially if they're feeling like they're either not important or not cared for, or even if that's not what's going on for their partner. It's much harder to take those kinds of risks because we don't really trust that it's going to go well. Especially if we've had other instances in our life where it hasn't gone well, as you mentioned before. It just makes that much harder. But I agree with you that we don't value emotional intimacy like we value, like when we talk about like success in our world, it's usually more things like how much education you have, like how much money do you make, what kind of job. It's not like how emotionally connected you are with your couple. Like we don't measure success like that usually. So I do think it's devalued in some way. Anyway. Yeah.
I also think that couples learn from what they've seen, and very often it's coming from their own family of origin. So whatever relationship they saw their parents have, they kind of think that's and not always consciously, I think in fact most times unconsciously, that is the pattern there's to follow, and they follow it. Again, not always consciously. And yet when we discuss it and they begin to define what it is that their parents had, sometimes what happens is an aha moment in that, wow, this is what I'm here talking about and this is what I'm describing. And they begin to connect the two, that they've kind of learned this. I mean, relationship is learned behavior. So they've learned how to relate in this manner as a couple.
That's a really helpful part of therapy because sometimes it doesn't look exactly or identically like what their parents were experiencing, but the process is the same.
Right.
They're similar feelings, and so we get to help them see that.
You know, I mean, I'm also just thinking just beyond that, I think, you know, with our trends of, you know, people getting married and things like that, a lot of kids don't grow up witnessing a relationship. So sometimes they're witnessing an abusive, you know, a very abusive, dominant, or very unhealthy relationship. Sometimes they're not witnessing any kind of couple relationship. And so there's really no model. And for folks who identify as anything like other than heterosexual, there's often not a model, you know, a tangible model in their lives also. So I think there's, you know, there's a lot of reasons that people, you know, we don't learn this in school also. It's like we don't teach emotional intimacy in school. One of my pet peeves is just like what's more important, calculus or that? To your life, you know. So anyway.
I mean, it really does create an argument for teaching relationships from early schooling on and all the way through. About relationships and communication and how to deliver a message. One of the things I find I do with couples more often than anything else is help them define their own message and then deliver it. So they struggle with finding out what they actually are thinking and feeling, And once they find it, then they struggle with the stress of actually delivering it. And then they deliver it and they see something so different that they haven't experienced, because when they speak directly from their own thoughts and feelings, it doesn't lead to an argument, it doesn't lead to any animosity, it leads typically towards understanding. Might not be agreement, but it leads towards understanding, and then they have this experience that's so very different than what they were expecting. And that usually begins the change in the entire process for the couple, is once they have learned how to define and deliver a message.
That comes from somewhere like below the surface,
Yes.
a much more like honest, way of experiencing.
And that can take some time. I mean, that isn't
Sure.
something
Sure,
that
you have
happens
to
after
peel
one
back
session.
the passive aggressive comments and the
Right.
name calling and the kind of
Right.
go-to things that people have been using to communicate.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's complex, as we started with. I mean, it's certainly a complex reality. However, I think that one of the most rewarding things of helping couples, especially if they're parents, is that this improves the entire family system. And unfortunately, we're out of time for today. We hope you have enjoyed today's conversation on Relationships 101. You can reach us by going to our website at lasalle.edu/gradmft or lasalle.edu/gradcft to learn about all of our programs, and thank you for watching.